It was a bright and sunny afternoon in one of the most historic cities in the world. Tourists filled the streets, snapping pictures of the magnificent royal palace. The grand architecture and the golden gates shimmered in the sunlight, attracting visitors from every corner of the globe. Among them was a man. Let's call him Tom, a tourist who had traveled far to see the famous sights. Tom wasn't new to traveling. In fact, he had seen many cities, but today was different. He had been drinking for most of the day. It wasn't his first drink, and certainly not his last. He was feeling the effects of the alcohol. His steps were unsteady, and his laughter a little louder than usual. But that didn't stop him from wanting to have some fun. As Tom walked down the street, he noticed a royal guard standing at attention, perfectly still beside his horse. The horse was a majestic creature, its coat shining in the sunlight, and its eyes calm and steady. The guard, wearing a tall black hat and a red uniform, was clearly part of the palace's security team. His job was to stand guard, keeping watch over the entrance to the royal palace. Tom squinted at the scene. He had always been curious about the royal guards, but today, with the alcohol running through his system, his curiosity mixed with a sense of mischief. He wasn't sure why, but he found himself drawn to the horse. It was almost as if the horse was challenging him. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was just his adventurous side taking over, but Tom decided it would be fun to get closer. With a grin, he staggered toward the horse, moving a bit too quickly for his own good. He was laughing to himself, muttering under his breath, as he slowly approached the royal guard's horse. The guard didn't seem to notice him at first. Tom reached out a hand, intending to give the horse a pat on its mane, but as soon as his fingers brushed against the horse's glossy coat, the animal took a small step back, clearly startled. Tom laughed even louder, thinking it was all just part of the fun. He didn't know much about horses, but the idea of touching one that belonged to a royal guard seemed exciting to him. He stepped closer, trying to be more daring, and patted the horse's neck again. This time, the horse shifted slightly, snorting as if it wasn't enjoying the attention. Tom didn't stop. Instead, he continued to push his luck. He made a few more gestures, trying to get the horse to react. He had no idea that his playful behavior could be seen as disrespectful to the royal guard or the traditions that came with his job. All Tom cared about was having a good time on his vacation. He didn't think much about the consequences of his actions. The royal guard remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed ahead, giving no sign that he had noticed the drunken tourist's antics. Tom, however, wasn't paying attention to the guard. He was focused entirely on the horse, completely oblivious to the fact that his harmless fun could turn into something much bigger. Little did Tom know, the quiet and composed royal guard had his own plan for dealing with the situation, and it would soon teach Tom a lesson he wouldn't forget. As Tom continued to joke and laugh at the royal horse, the royal guard remained completely still. His posture was straight, his eyes focused ahead, and he didn't make a single move. He was a man trained for moments just like this, a professional in his role. He had been standing at his post for hours, unaffected by the tourists, children, or even the occasional loud chatter of the crowd. His job wasn't about engaging with the people. It was about standing watch, maintaining order, and ensuring the safety of the palace. The guard's name was Alex. He had been a part of the royal guard for several years and had learned to ignore distractions. He knew that people would often try to get a reaction out of him, whether it was by waving, yelling, or even making funny faces, but he wasn't there to entertain. His duty was to protect the palace, and that meant staying focused no matter what happened around him. Alex had learned to tune out everything else. The noise of the bustling city behind him, the laughter of tourists, the flashes of cameras, it all became background noise. He knew his horse, a beautiful and calm creature named Duke, also needed to stay focused. Horses, after all, were sensitive animals, and it took a great deal of training to keep them calm in the face of crowds and noise. Duke was the perfect companion for Alex, as both were trained for the most unpredictable situations. But today, there was something different about the situation. Alex noticed Tom approaching his horse from a distance. At first, he thought nothing of it. Tourists often stopped to admire the horses and take pictures. But as Tom got closer, Alex's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something about the way Tom was acting, loud, stumbling, and moving too quickly, that made Alex uneasy. The Royal Guard knew the rules. He was trained to stay calm, no matter what. However, he also knew that if anyone was to harm the horse or cause trouble, it was his responsibility to handle it. Without moving a muscle, Alex observed the tourist's actions closely, keeping an eye on Tom as he grew bolder, reaching out to touch the horse's mane. Duke snorted and took a small step back. It wasn't anything major, but it was enough to make Tom laugh even harder. He seemed to find the horse's reaction amusing, which only encouraged him to get closer. Tom leaned forward, attempting to touch Duke again, this time reaching for the horse's ear. The horse wasn't a toy or a circus animal to be poked or prodded, and Alex knew this all too well. Duke had been trained to follow orders, but even the most patient horses could only take so much. If Tom didn't stop, the situation could escalate quickly. But Alex did not move. He didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the scene, his mind calculating the best way to handle this without breaking his calm composure. The Royal Guard had a reputation for being unshakable. It was part of the job. He wasn't going to let some drunk tourist ruin that. Alex was still calm, but in his mind, he knew what had to happen next. The lesson would come soon enough, and Tom would understand that not everything should be treated as a joke. The Royal Guard, quiet and still, had no intentions of moving from his spot. He was waiting for the right moment, confident that when he made his move, it would be the last thing Tom would expect. Tom's confidence grew with each passing second. The horse, Duke, wasn't reacting as much as he had hoped, but that didn't stop him. In fact, it only encouraged him further. He swayed slightly, unsteady on his feet from the alcohol, but a large smile spread across his face. He found the whole situation amusing. The horse was calm. The guard was still as a statue, and the people around him seemed oblivious to what was happening. Tom thought it was the perfect moment to take things even further. He moved closer to Duke, leaning in with exaggerated care as if he were trying to sneak up on the horse. His fingers brushed against the horse's mane again. But this time he wasn't content with just that. With a giggle, Tom reached for Duke's ear, his fingers curling around it. He had no idea how much of a mistake this was, but in his mind, it was all harmless fun. The alcohol in his system made everything feel like a joke. Duke, however, was not as amused. The horse's eyes flicked toward Tom, and it stepped back slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Horses, like most animals, had boundaries. If someone crossed those boundaries, they could become frightened or even aggressive. Though Duke had been trained to stay calm in all situations, still, every animal had its limits. Tom didn't notice the change in the horse's demeanor. Instead, he laughed even louder and stepped forward once more, determined to get a bigger reaction. He didn't care that the horse was moving away. In his drunken state, he found it funny and tried to chase after the animal, laughing as if it were a game. The more the horse moved, the more Tom seemed to want to engage, unaware that this was no longer a harmless interaction. "Hey, come on, Duke, don't be shy." Tom slurred, still attempting to get closer, his hands now reaching for the horse's reins. He was so caught up in the moment that he didn't notice the guard's calm, watchful gaze on him. The guard's eyes never wavered. His face was a mask of professionalism. People around them started to notice the growing situation. A few tourists took out their phones, trying to capture the bizarre moment of a drunk man chasing a horse, while others looked at each other in confusion. Some whispered, wondering what the Royal Guard would do. Everyone seemed to sense that things were about to take a turn, but no one could predict exactly what would happen next. Tom finally managed to grab hold of the reins, but instead of stopping, he tried to pull the horse closer to him. laughing uncontrollably. He had no idea that horses were not like pets that you could drag around for fun. Duke was clearly becoming increasingly uncomfortable, snorting and pulling back. The situation was starting to get more out of hand. The royal guard, still standing silently at attention, could feel the tension growing. He had been trained for moments like this, where patience and calmness were essential. But at this point, it was clear that Tom's actions were going too far. Alex, the guard, made the decision that it was time for the lesson to begin. He would handle this in a way that Tom would never forget, but he knew he had to wait for just the right moment. For now, he stayed still, watching carefully. The next step, he knew, had to be well-timed, measured, and effective. As much as he wanted to step in and stop Tom immediately, he understood that some lessons were better learned the hard way. This moment would show Tom that his behavior wasn't just disrespectful. It could have consequences he couldn't predict. Alex, the royal guard, had been standing in complete silence, his mind sharp and focused, though his body remained still. His training had prepared him for all sorts of distractions, from noisy crowds to playful children. But today was different. The situation with Tom, the drunken tourist, had escalated to a point where Alex knew something had to be done. He couldn't let the behavior go on much longer, but he also knew that he needed to handle the situation calmly and carefully. The royal guard's job was more than just standing still. It was about maintaining order and discipline, and showing respect for both the palace and its traditions. It wasn't always easy. The horses, like Duke, had been specially trained to handle the chaos of a busy city, but even the most well-trained horses could become frightened or unsettled if they were pushed too far. Alex knew it was important to keep Duke calm, while also teaching Tom a lesson he wouldn't forget. As Tom continued to stumble around, trying to pull Duke closer, Alex's gaze never wavered. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He had been trained to respond with patience, and that was exactly what he would do. Alex wasn't the type to rush into things. He believed in waiting for the right moment, knowing that reacting too quickly could make the situation worse. Tom, on the other hand, was still unaware of the guard's quiet presence. His laughter grew louder, his steps more unsteady as he tried to interact with Duke in a way that was becoming more and more disrespectful. The horse, uncomfortable with the attention, had already moved back several steps, but Tom was persistent. He was now tugging at the reins, thinking it was all part of a fun game. He had no idea how serious the situation had become. The tourists around them were starting to sense the tension. Some looked at Alex, wondering when or if he would step in. Others whispered to each other, not sure what to make of the scene. There were a few who even raised their phones, ready to capture whatever happened next. But Alex remained still, watching everything unfold with careful eyes. He wasn't bothered by the attention. His focus was entirely on Tom and the horse. In his mind, Alex was calculating his next move. He wasn't going to physically intervene just yet. Instead, he would wait for Tom to push the boundaries just a little further. He knew that if he acted too soon, it might seem like an overreaction. The goal wasn't just to stop Tom's behavior. It was to show him that there were consequences to his actions, and that the royal guard, though silent and unmoving, was not to be taken lightly. As Alex stood his ground, the crowd grew quieter, watching and waiting. It felt as though the moment had slowed down, like time itself was holding its breath. The scene was almost surreal. Tom, drunk and unaware, continued to pull at the horse's reins, while the guard stood at attention, a figure of stillness in a sea of movement. The tension in the air was thick now, and it was clear that something would change in the next few moments. Alex's decision had been made. The lesson was coming, and Tom would soon understand the importance of respect, not just for the royal guard, but for the traditions and responsibilities that came with the job. The quiet guard had been waiting for just the right time, and that moment was fast approaching. The moment had finally arrived. Alex, the royal guard, knew it was time to act. His eyes had been fixed on Tom, the drunken tourist, as he continued to taunt and pull at the reins of Duke, the royal horse. The horse had been patient up until now, but it was clear that Tom wasn't going to stop anytime soon. It was no longer a harmless joke. It was becoming a disruption, and that couldn't be allowed. Alex had made his decision. He wasn't going to yell or rush forward. No, that wasn't his style. Instead, he signaled to Duke with a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It was a signal the horse knew well. The royal guard and his horse had been through countless situations together, and Duke had been trained to respond to subtle commands like this one. Without a second thought, Duke took a step forward. It wasn't a simple step. It was a strong, deliberate movement. The horse's large body slowly moved in the direction of Tom, who was still laughing and stumbling around, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. Tom looked up just in time to see the horse's large form moving toward him. For a split second, he froze, unsure of what was happening. Then, with a small lurch, Duke's shoulder bumped into him. The force wasn't strong enough to knock him over, but it was enough to send Tom off balance. Tom staggered backward, his arms flailing in the air as he tried to steady himself. The crowd around them gasped, some of them giggling at the sight. It was a strange moment, both surprising and slightly amusing, but no one had expected the Royal Guard's horse to move so suddenly. Tom, however, wasn't laughing anymore. His laughter stopped, replaced by a sense of confusion and panic. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the uneven ground, and he fell onto his backside with a loud thud. The surrounding tourists chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or show concern. But for Tom, it wasn't funny anymore. His face turned bright red as he sat on the ground, rubbing his behind where he had fallen. Looking up, he saw the royal guard standing tall and silent, his expression still calm and unchanging. The guard hadn't moved a muscle except for the brief signal he had given to his horse. Tom blinked several times, now fully realizing what had just happened. He had underestimated the situation, and now he was feeling the consequences of his actions. For a moment, Tom didn't know what to do. His mind was foggy from the alcohol, and he was embarrassed. He had thought that harassing the horse was funny, but now he saw the seriousness of the situation. The royal guard wasn't laughing, and neither was the horse. Tom scrambled to his feet, trying to steady himself, his cheeks burning with humiliation. "Hey, I didn't mean any harm," Tom stammered, his voice shaky. He tried to smile, but it felt forced. His attempt at humor had clearly fallen flat. The crowd had started to settle down. Some of them looked at Tom with pity, while others couldn't help but smile at the scene. No one had expected the royal guard to take action, but now that it had happened, it was clear that Tom's behavior had crossed a line. Alex, still standing tall and unmoving, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of firmness in it. "You've crossed a line, sir. You can't treat the horses this way." His words were quiet but carried weight. Tom didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, his head hanging low. He had learned the hard way that some things were not to be taken lightly. The royal guard, silent and composed, had shown him that. Tom stood there for a moment, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. One moment, he had been laughing, enjoying the attention he was getting from the crowd, and thinking it was all in good fun. The next moment, he found himself sitting on the ground, his pride bruised, and his face burning red with embarrassment. His heart was still racing from the surprise of the horse's sudden move, and his head was spinning from the alcohol. He looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The people who had been watching him earlier now seemed to be staring at him in silence. Some of them were shaking their heads, while others whispered quietly among themselves. A few even had their phones out, but they weren't taking pictures anymore. Instead, they were watching him closely, as if waiting for his next move. Tom slowly pushed himself up from the ground, his legs unsteady beneath him. He glanced up at the royal guard, still standing tall and unmoving beside his horse. The guard's face was as calm as ever, his eyes locked straight ahead. Tom couldn't read his expression, but he could feel the quiet authority in the air. It was as though the guard's very presence demanded respect, and Tom had clearly forgotten that in his drunken state. I didn't mean to upset anyone," Tom mumbled, wiping the dust off his clothes. His voice was shaky, and he could hear the embarrassment in his words. It was hard to admit that he had been wrong, but the truth was starting to sink in. He had crossed a line, and the guard had made sure he understood that. Tom glanced at Duke, the royal horse, who was calmly standing beside the guard, his eyes soft but alert. The horse had been so patient, and yet Tom had treated it like a toy. He felt a pang of guilt in his chest. Horses were beautiful, intelligent creatures, and they didn't deserve to be treated like that. He had made a fool of himself, and now he was the one who was paying the price. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He was still embarrassed, but now he realized that his actions had consequences. The royal guard wasn't some performer for tourists to entertain themselves with. The horse wasn't there for people to poke and prod. There were rules, traditions, and respect that came with the job, and he had ignored them. The crowd around him had quieted down, and now they were all looking at him. Some were still smiling, but it wasn't the same kind of smile. They weren't amused by his antics anymore. They were watching to see how he would handle the situation. It felt like everyone was waiting for him to do the right thing, but Tom wasn't sure what that was. He took another deep breath and slowly stepped toward the guard, trying to stand tall even though he felt small inside. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice sincere. "I shouldn't have done that. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." He looked at the horse, then at the guard, who still hadn't moved. The royal guard finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "Respect is earned, not given freely. Remember that for next time." Tom nodded quickly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He was grateful that the guard hadn't escalated the situation further, but he knew that he had learned a valuable lesson. He didn't need to be told twice. His behavior had been out of line, and the guard's quiet response had taught him far more than any lecture could. Tom turned and walked away slowly, his head down in shame. He didn't care if the crowd was watching. All he could think about was the guard's words and the lesson he had just learned. From now on, he would be more careful about the way he treated others, especially those who were doing their jobs with honor and dignity. Tom had left the scene, his steps slow and careful. The embarrassment of the moment still hung over him, but something about it felt different now. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the memory of the royal guard standing tall, calm, and unbothered by his foolishness. It was clear that the guard had dealt with troublemakers before, and Tom now understood that this wasn't just about a drunken mistake. It was about respect for others and their roles. Behind him, the royal guard, Alex, remained at his post, never once breaking his focus. His face still wore its usual expression, calm, composed, and slightly detached. He hadn't moved a muscle after Tom had apologized. But the truth was, Alex wasn't about to let the situation end without one last lesson. As Tom walked down the path toward the exit, feeling small and regretful, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around, half expecting to see the royal guard approaching him, perhaps to say something more. Instead, Alex was still standing with his horse, Duke, exactly where he had been. For a moment, nothing happened. Tom blinked, unsure of what to expect. But then, Alex raised his hand, making the subtle signal to Duke. Tom didn't see it coming. In an instant, Duke moved. The horse, calm and steady just moments before, took a few quick steps forward and headed straight toward Tom. The horse's large hooves struck the ground with purpose, each step a reminder of the powerful creature it was. Tom, still lost in his thoughts and not paying much attention, turned just in time to see Duke's massive form coming toward him. "Wait," Tom yelped, stepping backward in surprise, but Duke was already near him. The horse stopped just inches away, its head low and eyes wide. Tom's heart raced again, his hands instinctively reaching out to steady himself against a nearby stone wall. He had expected to be left alone, but now, with the horse so close to him, he felt an odd mixture of fear and awe. It wasn't an aggressive move. Duke's calm, steady gaze met Tom's, as though the horse knew exactly how to make him think twice. Alex, standing at a distance, watched the scene unfold. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet confidence that Tom would get the message. The horse had moved, not to harm Tom, but to remind him that there were boundaries in life, and those boundaries must be respected. Tom's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He took another step back, his embarrassment from earlier now mixing with the humbling reality of the moment. For a moment, he felt as though he was trapped in the situation he had caused. He was too embarrassed to speak, too proud to apologize again. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. Duke turned around, stepping calmly back to his place beside Alex. The horse's hooves made a soft sound on the pavement, and with one final glance toward Tom, Alex gave a small nod. Tom stood there, his face redder than ever. He could feel the weight of the lesson that had just been taught, and it was clear that Alex's silent message had hit home. He had come to understand that some lessons in life weren't spoken. They were shown, and when it came to respect, there were no shortcuts. With a heavy sigh, Tom looked back at the royal guard and his horse. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew he would never forget the lesson he had learned that day. He turned and walked away once more, this time with a deeper understanding of the world around him. He had learned that respect was something that needed to be earned, and that sometimes the quietest people had the strongest impact. As Tom disappeared into the crowd, Alex remained where he stood, unmoved. His job was done. He had taught the lesson, and now it was up to Tom to carry it with him. The day went on, but Tom couldn't shake off the events that had just unfolded. He walked through the streets, surrounded by the laughter and chatter of other tourists, but he felt like he was in a world of his own. His steps were slower now, and the weight of his actions pressed on him. His pride, once high from the excitement of being a tourist in a new city, had taken a serious hit. Tom glanced over his shoulder a few times, half expecting to see the royal guard still watching him. But Alex was gone. The horse, Duke, was back at his post, as calm and composed as ever. The whole experience had been a strange one, but it had left Tom with something more important than just a memory. It had left him with a lesson. As he walked toward a nearby cafe, Tom couldn't help but think back to that moment when the royal horse had moved toward him. The shock of it, the suddenness, it had made him feel small. He had never imagined that a simple mistake, a careless moment of fun, could turn into something so serious. He had thought the royal guard was just another part of the city's entertainment, like the street performers and the tour guides. But now he saw that there was so much more to it. The way Alex had handled the situation, so calm and disciplined, had made an impression on Tom. There were no loud words, no angry gestures, just a quiet, strong response that made him realize how far he had overstepped. The horse's movement had been the perfect reminder of the boundaries that existed, not just for the guard, but for everyone. Respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. Tom sat down at a table outside the cafe and ordered a drink, but his mind wasn't focused on the drink or the view anymore. His thoughts were still with Alex and Duke, how different things would have been if he had just respected the guard and the horse from the start. Instead of a funny story to tell, it had become a moment of deep learning. Tom realized how easy it was to forget respect for others, especially when you thought they were part of the background, not the focus. But now he understood that everyone had their role to play, and some roles, like that of the royal guard, demanded a certain level of reverence. As he sat there, reflecting on his mistake, Tom's phone buzzed. It was a message from his friend, asking how his day had been. Tom paused before replying. He could tell his friend about the funny encounter with the horse, but deep down, he knew this wasn't a story to laugh about. It was a story about learning to respect people and animals alike, about understanding that some jobs were about more than just standing still. They were about responsibility, honor, and tradition. Tom replied to his friend's message with a short note about the royal guards. He didn't mention the incident with the horse, but he couldn't help but smile a little at the thought. Maybe one day he'd share the story, but for now, he was content to know that he had learned something important from a simple mistake, a lesson that he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. As he finished his drink and stood to leave, Tom looked around the city one last time, seeing it with new eyes. The streets, the buildings, even the royal guard. Everything seemed different now. He was no longer just a tourist. He was someone who understood the value of respect. And that was something he would never forget. The next morning, Tom woke up feeling different. He had slept well, but his mind was still focused on the events of the previous day. It wasn't just the fall or the embarrassment. It was the quiet way the royal guard, Alex, had handled the whole situation. Tom found himself thinking about the lesson he had learned. It was more than just a simple mistake. It had been an eye-opening experience, one that had left him with a deeper understanding of respect. As he walked around the city that day, he couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere felt different. The tourists, the guards, the horse-drawn carriages, everything seemed more meaningful now. It wasn't just about taking pictures or seeing the sights. There was a sense of history, tradition, and responsibility that he hadn't paid much attention to before. Tom passed by the royal palace again, the place where everything had happened. He paused for a moment and looked at the guards standing in their usual positions. They were still as statues, their uniforms neat and perfect. He remembered the way Alex had stood tall, completely unshaken by the chaos around him. There was something impressive about that. It wasn't about showing off strength or power. It was about having control over yourself and your actions. As Tom walked past the guards, he saw a few tourists attempting to get too close to the horses again, some of them even trying to touch the horses' reins. For a brief moment, he thought about warning them, but he quickly realized that it wasn't his place to do so. Respect was something you had to learn on your own, and it was up to each person to figure it out. He smiled to himself. Yesterday, he might have been one of those tourists, the ones who didn't think twice about boundaries. But now he understood. Now he knew that every action had consequences, and sometimes the quietest people had the most powerful impact. Later that day, Tom decided to visit a local museum. It was one of the many places he had planned to see, but now it felt different. As he walked through the exhibits, he paid attention to the details he might have missed before, like the historical stories behind the objects, the meanings of the paintings, and the way every piece seemed to tell a story of its own. It wasn't just about admiring art or reading about history. It was about appreciating the effort and respect that had gone into creating everything around him. As he sat down to have lunch later that afternoon, he reflected on the lesson the royal guard had taught him. It wasn't just about standing still or being silent. It was about being present in the moment and showing respect for what was around you. It was about being mindful of your actions and understanding the importance of the people and things you might take for granted. Tom thought back to the moment when the horse had moved toward him. The suddenness of it had shocked him, but now he saw it for what it was, a lesson in respect. It wasn't about anger or punishment. It was a reminder of how important it was to treat everything and everyone with care and consideration. As he finished his lunch and prepared to leave, Tom felt a sense of peace. He wasn't the same person who had stumbled around the palace the day before. He had learned something valuable, and it was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As he walked out of the cafe, he gave one last glance at the royal guard's standing watch. He knew that, in some ways, they would always be there, not just as protectors of the palace, but as reminders of the lessons they had taught him. And with that, Tom walked on, a little wiser, a little more respectful, and ready for whatever the next chapter of his adventure would bring.